Today, Tim Loughton joins me, who is a former
Hi,
Conservative
Jamie.
politician. Tim, welcome to the podcast. Well, thank you very much for joining me. So, Tim, you've got quite an interesting background even before politics, because you were a student as an archaeologist, which is quite something. So could you go ahead and talk to me about
Good
why you
question.
decided to do that?
I've been involved in politics for a long time, and I joined the Conservative Party when I was, about 14 years old, which was way back in the 1970s, ancient history. And was involved locally, Young Conservatives it was then. Then I went to university. I went first to University of Warwick, where I studied classical civilization, which was a heavily archaeology-based course. Archaeology has always been the great love of my life. I went on my first dig at the age of 9 on a Saxon farmstead in the South Downs near where I live. So I really enjoyed that course. But of course, I got involved in politics as well, was a member of what was then the Federation of Conservative Students at Warwick University. Quite a radical left-wing university, so it's quite fun. Coming into open combat with the trots, as we call them in those days, but all good fun. Then I went on to I decided I wanted to put off for another year before I actually got a proper job. So I went to Cambridge and was lucky enough to spend a year studying Mesopotamian archaeology, which was a bit niche. There are only 2 of us in the whole of Cambridge doing it, and the other guy was clearly going to spend most of his life under canvas in the desert, living in poverty. Whereas I decided I'd keep it as a sort of amateur interest, as a hobby, and I went off and got a proper job in the city and carried on my politics from London then.
That's quite interesting. You mentioned that only 2 people were doing your course. I've always said that university can be so specific. So what actually did you learn on your course? Because I've never heard of this type of archaeology before.
Is effectively it's Iraq. So I'd never been to Iraq, and all the time I was studying, Iraq was too dangerous a place to go to. But I actually got to visit and went digging in Iraq just 3 years ago with the British Museum. But effectively, Mesopotamia is the cradle of civilization, going back 5,000 BC, Sumerians, Babylon, the Akkadians, the Ziggurats, hieroglyph writing, cuneiform, all that sort of thing, and a great tradition of eccentric British archaeologists living in the desert, digging up important sites like Ur in Iraq, which I got to visit back in 2023. And the British Museum is currently doing a long-term dig in a place called Girsu, which is the oldest surviving bridge in the world, going back to 3000 BC. And they just discovered a royal palace, and I was invited to go and join their team out there just after the Gaza-Israel troubles. So it was a rather more dangerous place to be. So we had to have armed guard the whole time. But at the end, it was fine. But I was a dog in clover, I tell you, digging in a trench in the middle of the desert at 5:30 in the morning, because it was 40 degrees by lunchtime. So we had to do most of our digging in the morning, digging up things that had not seen the light of day for over 5,000 years, whilst also being an MP at the same time. So I just took just over a week off to go and indulge myself, which was fantastic, and I'm hoping to go back again.
It sounded very interesting. I might have to invest my time into looking into this. It sounds like quite something. Well, it sounds like you do. You said there that you spent a lot of time in the city to get a proper job, as you said. Why did you decide to go into the city? Because I know that London has all these opportunities, and was that the place for you to really try and invest into your dream?
Invest in my dream. God, that's a great phrase. I always knew that ultimately I probably would end up doing something in politics. And I think one of the things I learned was, don't go into politics full-time professionally too early. Get a proper job, establish yourself, build a career, because politics can go very wrong, and you need something to be able to fall back on. And actually getting experience of the real world, be it in business, through various other professions, I think makes a politician better at their job, more rounded, more experienced. So a lot of my friends had gone into the city and seemed to be doing well. I considered whether I wanted to train as a lawyer. That would have meant more years at law school and things like that. So anyway, I applied for a few jobs, got a job working for a company which then became Robert Fleming, which is a Scottish merchant bank, which is now part of J.P. Morgan, largest bank in the world, involved with private client investment management, which was great job, nice firm to work for, and I worked with them for 16 years, only with the one firm, but all the time being busy on the outside doing my political stuff, with a view to one day standing for Parliament, becoming a full-time MP, which I eventually did.
So when you were having your full-time job and you were doing some bits on the side, I'm presuming that was like canvassing and some campaigning. Did you ever feel like you were sort of trying to force yourself in? Because I often get the idea that if you loudly say I want to become an MP, I want to stand, that it could put other people off in your local party.
Interesting. I mean, I was pretty precocious, I have to say. So as a teenager, when people asked me what we wanted to do, so sometimes I say, well, I quite like to be Prime Minister, which was a bit presumptuous. But I enjoy politics, and the reason I got involved in politics was I was fed up of sort of watching the television, watching all the things going on wrong in the world. And back in the 1970s was a pretty turbulent time, way before you were around, I'm sure. But we had the winter of discontent. We had union strikes all over the place. We had all the problems in the mid 70s. Britain was bust. So you could either sort of shout at the television and complain and do nothing about it, or you could shout at the television and complain and go out and do something about it. So I decided I would go and join a political party. I chose the Conservative Party. It was just after Mrs. Thatcher had become leader of the Conservative Party back in 1975. She was obviously a controversial character now, but deeply inspiring. And on the back of that, I became a very active Young Conservative in the Young Conservative movement. Did student politics, as I said, Federation of Conservative Students. Came down to London, got involved with the local constituency party then in Battersea, where I was living. Got involved with the local council, stood for the council, but didn't actually win. I stood in a heavily Labour seat where I was living. And so, but there were a lot of people in the local party who were also ambitious that way. And in fact, Battersea, part of Wandsworth, traditionally a very strong Conservative borough, and lots of other well-known Conservative politicians came up through the ranks in Wandsworth as well. So it was a good training ground, and good for community politics. So my politics has always been, getting out on the street, engaging with local people. It's not just something you do back in an office. You need to roll up your sleeve, get your hands dirty, get involved in local community projects, knock on lots of doors. And I was living in a ward at the time which was lots of big tower blocks, which frankly no politician had really knocked on the door for ages. And we knocked on every single door in every single tower block, and came dangerously close to winning, which I wasn't really in a position to do at the time. But we reduced a Labour majority of 1,600 to just under 300, which was quite an achievement. So that whetted my appetite. This was back in 1990. And then I got the chance to stand for Parliament in 1992 up in Sheffield Brightside for the first time.
You mentioned there earlier that you get into politics later than earlier. And as a young person, it just seems like, I don't know, next year seems like years and years away. But I suppose for you, you'd probably tell me different. In 1992, you ran in Sheffield Brightside, as you said. And speaking to loads of other former Tory politicians, they tell me that to become a Tory politician, you've got to get onto the Conservative parliamentary candidate list. Was that the same back then?
And I don't think it's that different for Labour Party. Lib Dems, not quite sure how they do it. But traditionally then, what you did is you got some experience, you got your hands dirty, you got a sort of track record campaigning, and then you might stand for the local council, you might be a councillor, but you needed to have a track record and show that you knew what you were doing. And then if you wanted to take it that step further to run for Parliament, you would apply to Conservative Central Office to go on their candidates list. And in those days, that involved going on a full weekend sort of scrutiny course with, I think in my case, about 48 other people, and put through some quite grilling tests and things. And at the end of that, you were told, yep, fine, we think you're up to it. You can go on the approve list, or don't call us, we'll call you, basically. Perhaps being an MP is not for you, or either that or go out and get a bit more experience and come back in a couple of years' time or whatever. Fortunately, I got put on the list first time round, and that then means when a constituency is looking for a new candidate, if there's a sitting MP, they may be retiring, or they're looking for a new candidate if it's not a sitting Conservative seat. They would advertise it, and if you're on the approved list, you can then apply, and then you go in front of the local members, and it's up to them as to decide which candidate they choose. So, in fact, when I was selected for Sheffield Brightside in 1992, the list had closed because it was full, but I was given special dispensation to stand there. And then straight after the 1992 general election, because funnily enough, I lost that election by 22,500 votes to David Blunkett. Nice guy. We got on really well. I was then able to go through the selection process, and I got put on the approved list. So when I then came to apply for other seats for the 1997 election, I was on the approved list at that time. And that was pretty standard way of applying in those days.
It must have been quite something. You've just got to win so many mini elections, it seems, to be able to run in the first place. But when you did stand in a seat that was basically impossible to win, does that demotivate you? Or is your aim just to try and... Well, what is your aim in that situation if you are not going to win that seat?
It's changed a bit now, but in those days, certainly in my party, and I think, again, it's probably not different for Labour Party and others, you needed to prove yourself. So most candidates would stand in what we call a no-hope seat. So I stood against David Blunkett, Sheffield Brightside, sort of, Socialist Republic of South Yorkshire, central traditional Labour seat for ages, 24,000 majority. You're not going to win it, but you need to show that you're a competent candidate. You need to show that you run a good campaign. You need to motivate quite a small local membership. And in my case, I reduced the majority from 24,000 to 22,500, which was no mean feat. Got quite a solid vote, and got on very well with the local party and got some good recommendations. So that set me up for standing for a winnable seat next time. So you have to go through that. Some people are lucky enough that they get selected straight away into what would be a sitting Conservative seat in my case. It doesn't happen that often, but in those days, the vast majority of people had to go through the pain and the experience of doing a no-hope seat to show that you're up to actually being a full-time MP and getting a good chance next time round.
As a seasoned MP, what's your thoughts about running in? So I know a few MPs that they've only run in the seat that is their home, and they said, I've never run in any other seat because it's my home. As a seasoned politician, is that true? Do some MPs just only want to stand for their own home? If you wanted that, you're
highly unlikely ever to get elected. That is the problem. And there are 650 constituencies. It's largely pot luck where you end up. So when I applied in 1995 for winnable seats, so these were constituencies that had existing Conservative MPs who were retiring, so they needed a new candidate. The seat I eventually got, East Worthing and Shoreham in Sussex, there are 197 applicants. So, there's quite a lot of competition, certainly in those days. It's nothing like that these days, but in those days it was very competitive. So you need to put in for quite a lot of seats, and most of those, therefore, will be seats with which you have no particular connection. Now, I was really lucky in 1995 in that a lot of Sussex constituencies, which in those days was completely Conservative, a lot of the sitting Conservative MPs were retiring anyway. So a number of Conservative constituencies in Sussex came up that I was able to apply for. And I was born in Sussex. I grew up in Sussex, went to school in Sussex. So I had strong links with Sussex, and particularly strong links with the constituency I ultimately represented when my father went to school, grandfather was a headmaster at a local school, etc., etc. But that was pot luck, and you'll get other MPs who apply for a seat at the other end of the country with whom they have no connections, but they like the cut of your jib, and you get selected. It's harder that way because you then got to establish your credentials with the electorate to say, why is somebody from Sussex looking to represent a seat in Northumberland or Wales or something like that. So it's better if you've got those local connections, but in a perfect world, it doesn't work like that. But I was lucky because, as I say, I had those Sussex connections. I ended up with a Sussex seat. The person who's replaced me, I won't make any comment about how he's getting on, but he came from London, had no Sussex connections. So he then got to spend his initial months and years getting familiar with the area, with the constituency, having not known it previously, and that's more of a challenge.
You had no social media in 1997, which sort of probably proves.
Yeah,
really,
I am, but
are you not a fan of the old social media?
As well. So in when I became an MP in 1997, emails didn't exist. So we got a big post bag of physical hard copy letters and postcards every day. I mean, it's hard to imagine that now, but we will get dozens and dozens of letters every day, and we had to reply to them either by ringing somebody up or typing out a physical letter in the days before. Well, we just about had word processors there, but computers were still quite new. So it was completely different. Now, the upside of that is that constituents had to make more of an effort to contact you, and they had to invest in the price of a stamp as well. Whereas now, a constituent wants to contact you, and particularly if it's part of a big sort of emailing campaign for some charitable lobbying organisation, all they have to do is to press forward on their computer keyboard. No expense, no great effort involved, which is why certainly when I finished being an MP, we were getting something like 300, 350 emails a day, a lot of which were sort of circulars about general campaigns as well. But social media has become a norm, and now you have constantly to consider what you're going to do on your Instagram, on your Facebook page. Are you going to tweet in response? And that takes up a lot of time. I'm not sure the time you expend in it is really worth the output that you get. There's a lot of rubbish on social media, but like it or not, it's a factor of modern life, and like it or not, politicians have to now be part of that. But it was much, much simpler back in 1997 before we had all that stuff, I had to say. But again, the upside is it's a way of instantly getting your message across and communicating with thousands of your constituents that you couldn't have done by writing 74,000 hard copy letters to each constituent that you had back in 1997.
When you are an MP, you get to build a backroom team. You have caseworkers, you have some other people there as well. So could you talk to me through how you hired your team, if you managed to hire a team, and what are the positions in there as well?
And everybody, we get all this, or I don't now because I'm no longer an MP, but MPs always get a lot of flack about so-called expenses and the budgets for running their offices. The vast majority of the money for running an MP's office goes on employing people. So as I say, I was getting 300, 350 emails a day. I also have to be in Parliament Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday most weeks. I need to prepare for debates. I need to ask questions. I'm on select committees, which I need research. So you cannot do that all on your own. So you need to employ a group of people. So I had usually at least 3 people in my London office. We had a constituency office in Worthing, where I had an agent, and we had a secretary as well, taking care of things locally. Now, I was very lucky in that my predecessor, Terence Higgins, who was the MP for Worthing for 33 years before I took over part of his constituency, I inherited his secretary, and she worked for me right up till 2024, part-time, after she semi-retired. And she had been working in Parliament since the 1980s, and that was really invaluable. She knew, where the bodies were buried, how Parliament worked. Really good at her job. So I, started with an advantage there. So she basically took care of most of the correspondence and dealing with constituents on the telephone. Then I employed a researcher. And actually, mostly, I was able to get some local people from the constituency with Sussex connections, again, which was an advantage because they knew the terrain, they knew the issues and the geography of the place. So I had a full-time researcher, a full-time secretary, sort of head of office, and then we usually had a third part-time person who would do overflow casework or help on some research as well. We had interns from time to time, which were most of them were pretty good, and they were quite helpful. By the time I left, because the casework had got more and more over that time. I had a full-time head of office, a full-time researcher, a part-time two part-time caseworkers, and a fifth person who sort of looked after all the office finances and all the admin stuff, as well as an intern. So, and in the constituency, we had an agent and a second person who worked in the office largely for me. So the staff expanded, but that's because the work expanded. There's a lot more correspondence, a lot more to do than we had back in 1997. The job changed hugely over that period, and that's largely down to social media, computers, communications.
I don't think people often think about like MPs' mental health. And I suppose when you are getting 350 emails a day, that's something, and there are probably a few negative ones in there, and you are just constantly doing something. Is it hard to switch off? How do you switch off? And I suppose the job is
really
much harder than what people may make
mental
out.
health was a real taboo issue, certainly back in 1997. People didn't really talk about mental health generally amongst the population. People talked about people having mental breakdowns, and that was the end of that to some people. And to be an MP, to admit to any sort of mental illness was it could be a nightmare. Why would constituents want to elect an MP who's got a mental illness? Because the understanding of it and the fact that mental illness is an illness. It's just like heart disease, lung disease, or whatever. It just happens to be a mental illness rather than a physical illness, and it can be treated and dealt with. And I think societal attitudes have changed hugely over the last 25 years about people's understanding of mental illness and how you can deal with it. And a few brave MPs, probably 20 years ago, actually got up in Parliament and said, I suffer from a mental illness. And it may be a low-level mental illness, it may be a long-standing one or whatever. But for them to do that was really, really brave and broke the mold. And it was a really good thing to do, to show to everybody else that the MPs are just humans, like anybody else. We suffer from the same problems as everybody else. Mental illness is one of those. We are in particularly high-pressure jobs. So actually, the incidence of mental illness amongst MPs should be higher than the general population for all the pressures that are on us, because it's a 24/7 job. If you're not getting 350 emails a day, you're getting, something's gone wrong in the constituency. You have to be available to respond. You have to do media. You get media bids the whole time. Something's going wrong in the Middle East. You'll get hundreds of emails saying, "What are you doing about whatever it may be?" It's a constant high pressure job, and it's absolutely right that MPs should embrace mental illness as part of the problems that we all suffer from. But the law had to be changed as well. If you'd been absent from Parliament because you'd had a mental illness for 6 months, you would lose your job. Where else would that happen? There could be a by-election because you're deemed no longer fit. Despite the fact you may be getting treatment and you're recovering, 6 months and that was it. That had to be changed, and that was an important part of it as well. So now I think it's been mainstreamed. It's no longer a taboo issue, thank goodness. And MPs can be viewed, although not many people do, as ordinary human beings like everybody else, subject to the same ailments.
And that's true as well, because you mentioned, the average person, for example, does get time off on weekends, and perhaps if you're a teacher, you get half terms. MPs, as far as I'm aware, they do also get time off. They get parliamentary recess. And is that up to the MP to decide whether they can go away or if they want to spend the time in the constituency?
It's absolutely up to the MP as to how you spend your time, how you work your day or whatever. But it's the most unpredictable job. So something can come completely out of the blue. And it is a 7-day-a-week job. So people think, that being the job of MP is just turning up in Parliament and what you do in the chamber. Most MPs probably spend less than 5% of their working week in the chamber of the House of Commons. Now, that doesn't mean that we're off partying or lying on a beach somewhere. if I had to spend all my time in the chamber, where am I going to get the time to respond to those 350 emails? I mean, I looked at every single email that came to me. I would go through them first. I'd then triage them off to various members of staff to answer. The more complicated ones, where it's more appropriate, I would take them myself to do. I quite often would catch up on my emails on a Sunday night. So it was quite fun actually responding to a constituent's email at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night, as I often had to do to keep on top of my work. And the constituents say, "What are you doing working at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night?" I was saying, "Well, I have to, because I need that time to do it." But you need to take time off as well. So the parliamentary recesses, so we're in the middle of the Easter recess at the moment. So Parliament's been in recess for 2 weeks, I think, including the Easter bank holiday weekend. That's the time to also catch up with some constituency stuff, because you have to be in Parliament usually Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. You can't be in your constituency. During the recess, it means you can do lots more things in your constituency that you haven't been able to do while Parliament is sitting. But also MPs need to have holidays too. The trouble is, you go off and have a family holiday. We've all got families. I had young children when I first became an MP. And the poor old Defence Secretary, I see, has just been criticised because he's just come back from holiday with his family whilst things are going on in Iran. Well, no doubt he would have had to be in 24-hour contact with his office and responding to things, even when he was on holiday. We need to take some holidays, particularly for this high-pressure job, as we've just discussed already. So MPs can't win. You're damned if you do, damned if you can't. But we just need to remember that MPs are just ordinary, fallible human beings, and we need to have downtime, very little of it, as well as the high-pressure job that we do most days of the week.
No doubt there that the Defence Secretary would have had security when he went to France, just like the Prime Minister, and obviously all the top dogs as well. But as an ordinary MP, if you're heading to Spain, for example, I highly doubt someone's going to recognise you. But is there ever a thing that you need to be? Is there a security with you? And when you're back home in the constituency, what is the security like for an MP?
I have. We've just had a long holiday in the Far East, and I was in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam last month. In a shopping centre, and somebody came up to me and said, "Oh, it's Tim, isn't it?" And he and three of his mates were on holiday out there, and they were former constituents of mine. The following day, we were going down the tunnels from the Vietnam War, popped up, and there was somebody from the next village who plays tennis with my wife as well. You get recognised all over the place, so you constantly have to, watch over your shoulder, because it's not a good look if you're found dancing on the tables in a bar in Ho Chi Minh City or something, and your constituents are there, and they've got a camera, and there's social media, so you can never quite divorce yourself from the job as well. So in terms of the security angle of it, actually that's got a lot worse as well. So now, I never had this, but incredibly, my predecessor now has a bodyguard when he goes to do street surgeries and things like that. That was unheard of 10, 20 years ago. Remember, 2 MPs have been murdered in their constituents, going about their work in the last few days. And I'm afraid there are a lot of people who take politics rather too seriously and think that politicians are fair game for physical abuse as well as abuse online, and that's a very worrying trend in politics. So we've all had to take far greater notice of our security, which I'm afraid is a great sadness, but it's a feature of our time.
Which is obviously a huge negative of the job. People then often criticise the financial salaries of MPs. I know it's just gone up recently, I believe, to £98,000 a year for an average MP. With all of this putting into perspective, do you recommend being
it's a
member of Parliament?
Job, but you've got to be thick-skinned, and you are going to get. It's a really satisfying job when you can do stuff that really changes the lives and the outlook of your constituents. It may be a small thing, but it means a lot to them. When you can change the law and be part of something that, again, improves the lot of UK PLC or groups of people within the population. No other job can achieve those sorts of things. You can only do that working with at least 325 other people to give you majority in Parliament, and it can be hugely frustrating. But it's an amazing, unique job, and I absolutely don't regret having spent 27 years of my life doing it. But I'm afraid MPs are the source of huge amounts of criticism, most of it unfair, because most of us are just trying to get on with our job. It's an extraordinary job. It's an important job in the interests of our constituents and the country at large. But all the public and the media fuels this, is really concerned about is expenses, salaries and things like that. So an MP salary now is pretty high. As you say, it's now well into the 90s. Those salaries are not determined by Parliament. That changed back in 2010. It's decided by IPSA, an independent body based on what other public service workers and others are getting paid. But MPs still get blamed if the increase seems to be too high. But if we get our pay frozen, as happened in the past as well, MPs don't get the benefit of that either. So again, damned if we do, damned if we don't. But you don't go in it for the money. And I have to say, when I left Parliament in 2024, I was earning less than I made in the city when I became an MP back in 1997. So if I went into Parliament to make lots of money, I didn't do a very good job of it. But I absolutely don't regret it. And I think there are question marks that you've got new MPs, particularly very young MPs. You've got, I think, one MP is as young as 24, 25, going straight on a salary of 95, 98,000 pounds. You wouldn't get that in many other jobs. Could salary perhaps be linked to age of experience? So, your salary, if you've been an MP for 5 years, 10 years, you get paid more than in your first year. I mean, it would be really difficult. That may be something that needs to be looked at. But, we are doing the jobs equivalent to leaders in business, running local councils. We have to be jack of all trades for very unsocial hours, working, typically over 80 hours a week, and over weekends being available straight away 24/7. We're not overpaid compared to many other parliamentarians in other parts of the world as well. But there are many people who think that MPs shouldn't get paid anything, in which case you wouldn't get very good MPs.
Yeah, I completely agree. When you first got into Parliament, your first, I believe, about 12 years was spent with a Labour majority. That must be so much harder to push things through, especially if a local constituent wants to speak to a cabinet minister. What was that like for you then? Did it make your job harder? Because I know later on you ended up being a shadow
point.
minister.
So I was in Parliament from 1997 to 2024. From 1997 to 2010, we had a Labour government. So almost half of my time in Parliament was in opposition. And that can be very, very frustrating. It also has its advantages because it's easier to sort of attack the government for everything that's going wrong. But at the same time, it's frustrating if you want to see changes that are going to benefit your constituents, and yet it may not be the policy of the opposition Labour government. You're less likely to get those changes brought about. It can also be very frustrating with your own government. There are various things my government did that I didn't agree with too. But in terms of access to ministers and getting decisions on things that really should go your way, you're more likely in government. So 13 years was quite frustrating. But for most of that time, I became a shadow minister back in 2000, so quite early on. So I had responsibilities of being an MP and looking after my constituency, also being an MP in Parliament and scrutinising the government of the day. And then the third part of that job was being, in my case, I became the shadow minister for health and then children. So I had to research all our policy and work with others to see what our policy was going to be at the elections around children's social care, health matters, mental health. I was a shadow minister for mental health at one stage as well. And you do that with very few resources, whereas when you become a minister, as I did in 2010, you've got thousands of civil servants working for you and access to all sorts of experts. So actually Parliament, and again, I think this is a weakness in the system and government, is quite one-sided. If you're a minister, you've got access to huge amounts of resources and research. If you're a shadow minister, you have to pull in whatever favours you can and look for funding to help with research and researchers and others. And it's very lopsided. And I think that's a weakness in the system. If you have a much better informed opposition, they're in a much better position properly to scrutinise the government and call them out when they're making mistakes, doing something wrong, and improving legislation. So it's another weakness in the system that I think still needs to be addressed.
And when you were a shadow minister for children, that isn't one of the biggest roles that I've heard of in Parliament. So for you to be able to research quite a niche job and to go ahead and also battle that out with your normal MP job in the constituency, what did you focus on more? Because obviously, probably as a shadow minister and obviously eyeing up to be a minister, that is on a personal level, but also there are people in the constituency
Absolutely right.
that need your help as well.
Again, you when you become a shadow minister, that's a huge chunk of your time that you've got to do, which takes away time from your constituents. So it's a real balance, looking after your constituency. And at the end of the day, your employers are, in my case, 74,500 people who had the vote in the East Worthing and Shoreham constituency, and woe betide you if you forget that. So you may be doing a fantastic job with your party or in Parliament, but if you neglect your constituents, then it's less likely they're going to vote for you again next time, and you won't be doing any job at all. So in 2000, I became Shadow Minister for Environment and Housing. And after the 2001 election, I went on to the health team. And again, it's a bit of a sort of hot luck as to where you end up. I had no great background in health. And in those days, children's social care came under the health brief. So I was given the responsibility for children's social care, children's health, children's mental health, and that became my speciality. And then in 2003, I think it was, the actual post of Minister for Children was created. It was a new post. So I then shadowed that post. So I had to work out how to be a shadow minister, but also had to work out how to be a shadow minister for shadowing a completely new ministerial post as well. The great thing about it was I was in that position under David Cameron for all the time in the rest of opposition up to 2010, which gave me a real opportunity to master my brief. And I spent a lot of time going around the country meeting social workers, meeting children in care, going and visiting schools, special educational needs stuff. It was quite a big portfolio, and I got a lot of experience, and I hope got quite a lot of respect within the sort of children's social care community, that here at least was somebody who could end up being a minister who knew a bit about what he was talking about, because I'd taken the time to go out and learn my stuff. That is a weakness in politics, that too often you're made a minister in a subject which is completely new to you. So one, you have to learn how to be a minister, because in 2010 I hadn't been a minister before, only a shadow minister. And two, you have to learn all about your brief as well. One good thing that David Cameron did do was to keep people in their positions from opposition then into government, so we could hit the ground running, as it were, and then work out how to be ministers, but at least knowing what we wanted to do from a policy point of view for in my case, children.
And I suppose when you were shadow minister, you decided on, was there some objectives that you wanted to achieve once you got that role under David Cameron?
In those days, we had some high-profile scandals and deaths amongst kids in the care system, or kids who should have been in the care system, or whatever. Victoria Climbié, Baby P, and other notorious cases. So a lot of time was spent on looking at those and how we can improve the system around child welfare. So that also, we wanted to reform the law in adoption. So I produced a big report on adoption before we got into government, and there were various other things like that we started with an agenda. So in 2010, the Shadow Health Secretary had been Michael Gove. Shadow Education Secretary was Michael Gove. He became the Education Secretary. The Shadow Schools Minister had been Nick Gibb, who was my neighbouring MP in Bognor Regis. He became the Schools Minister. shadow children's minister was me. I became the children's minister. That gave us a huge advantage that we could go into the Department of Education, and rather being told by the civil servants what we're expected to do, we could say to the civil servant, here is our program, here are our policies, we've done the background work on it, how do we now make these, bring these into law and make them a reality? And that was a huge advantage, which is why actually the Department for Education, I would say this, but it was true, we were one of the best performing departments. And the very first piece of legislation the new Conservative government brought in was an education bill around schools reform, which was one of the biggest successes of the last government.
Part of your, I suppose, legacy is, of course, going to be about this whole China debacle. And you were in opposition about this and talking about China and their human rights concerns. Could I just ask before we start speaking about this, why did you care so much about what was going on
really
the other side of the
point.
world?
And this was something that took up a lot of my parliamentary career and is still an issue because I'm still sanctioned by China, even though I'm no longer an MP. There were 7 of us who were sanctioned, 5 years ago now, 5 Conservative MPs and 2 members of the House of Lords. Now, I have a long-standing interest in Tibet, and it goes back to the days where some very close friends of my parents adopted a boy from Tibet, and my parents almost did the same. And so I took an interest in the area. And one of the first demonstrations I ever went on as a spotty teenager was with a group of Tibetans demonstrating on human rights abuses by China outside the Chinese embassy in London. So I had a sort of long history being involved with Tibet. There was an all-party group for Tibet in Parliament, which I joined when I became a member, and I chaired for many, many years until I stood down in 2024. I've been to Dharamsala twice, where the Dalai Lama lives, and most of the Tibetan exiles escaped to across the Himalayas. So my interest in China and China's long-standing, appalling human rights abuses, which have been going on in Tibet since the 1950s. But again, it's an area of the world that few people know about or understand. And then, of course, more recently, we've had all the much more high-profile abuses of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the genocide going on in Xinjiang province, all the human rights abuses in Hong Kong in the last few years since the handover. And so, this was an area I wanted to speak out on, and did, and we got various changes to legislation affecting China, as a result of which the 7 of us who were the ringleaders, as it were sanctioned back in, I think it was 2022, 21, 22, when it was 5 years ago, and remain sanctioned today. But as far as I'm concerned, China is the biggest threat on the planet on so many levels. And what is going on in terms of the human rights abuses within China, in Xinjiang and in Tibet, but also outside of China, and the influence that China is very cleverly bringing to bear in so many of our institutions and our universities and our businesses and our council chambers, is deeply, deeply worrying. And the West needs to wake up, and is at last waking up to that and starting to take it seriously, but it should have done a long time ago.
And I suppose, though, Russia's on that same board as well. But in terms of this whole China debacle, you got deported from Djibouti, which is quite a unique place to go, I suppose. So what were you doing in Djibouti, and can you talk me through the deportation?
Parts of my parliamentary career. So this was, I think, 2 years ago, and actually I've been on a delegation to visit Somaliland, which is a really interesting place, which is a breakaway part of Somalia. And Somalia is a bit of a basket case, but Somaliland, which was a British protectorate back after the war, is a much more stable and interesting, exciting place. And I was asked to go, but it's not recognised as a country, although Israel and Taiwan and a few other places have recognised it. And I think the US may soon recognise it, which would be a game changer. And I think we should recognise it as well. So I was on a delegation to Somaliland, and Somaliland is right next to Djibouti. And China is a major player in Djibouti, and China is very anti the Somaliland government. So we made some speeches and met President and various other government members, and were critical of China's involvement in that area. I then flew back and decided I wanted to stop off in Djibouti because it's an interesting country. Also has the lowest level lake in the whole of Africa, which I was just wanted to go and visit. I was going to spend 24 hours in the country. I've been asked by the ambassador there to meet up with him and debrief him on our trip to Somaliland, and then I was going to get a plane on back home the following day. So I turned up at Djibouti airport and found myself in detention for 6 hours. They wouldn't let me in, and I was put on the next plane out without ever setting foot outside of the airport in Djibouti. And I have no doubt it's because when they looked up my details and they found this guy is very critical of China. China owns half the debt of Djibouti. They have their largest military base, naval base, in Djibouti. They own a lot of the infrastructure in Djibouti. Basically, Djibouti does what China tells it. And the computer says, don't let him in the country. So I got deported, which was a bit of an inconvenience, but first time I've ever been deported. But the worrying thing from that is, and still being sanctioned, is that we can arrive at any country which has an agreement or arrangements with China. We could find ourselves then on a rendition plane back to China. So hence needing to be unsanctioned is still quite important. And in fact, I've just been asked to go and see the Foreign Secretary next week to discuss the status of the sanctioned MPs, and in my case, the sanctioned ex-MP.
And would you ever go to China if they were to lift the restriction on you?
I would love to go to Tibet because I've never been to Tibet. I went to China as a tourist back in the 90s and went to Hong Kong, and in fact went to Xinjiang and over in the west of the country as well. But I'd love to be able to go to Tibet. I'd love to go to Tibet without probably having loads of spies and secret police constantly monitoring me. But that will be difficult. We asked to go to Tibet before we were sanctioned. We were never allowed to because it's a heavily censored part of the country. I'm not particularly interested in going to the rest of China, but I'd love to be able to go to Tibet. But hey, I'm not going to give up my calling out of China's human rights abuses and the threats I think they pose to the world, just in order to have a nice holiday in Tibet. And that's a cause that outside of Parliament now I'm keeping up, and I'm as vociferous as ever about.
During COVID-19, the Conservative Party faced a big load of backlash for Partygate, and I suppose maybe the handling of the virus itself. As a minister in Parliament, do you think the Conservatives' downfall was partly due to COVID?
I wasn't a minister at the time. I was a humble backbencher. I mean, it's a difficult one, and I think a lot of history has been rewritten unfairly. I remember when COVID first struck and we had lockdown, and I remember vividly, you probably do, that public broadcast that Boris Johnson gave as Prime Minister, when he looked the public in the eye, right down the camera, and says, "I must now give you an instruction that you must stay at home." And everybody sat up and absolutely took that seriously. And the way that the government handled the COVID crisis, which came out of the blue, nobody was preparing for anything like that. We were no different to most other countries. I think most people thought, that the government are on top of this, even though it was a whole new experience. And actually, the opinion poll ratings of Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party at the beginning of COVID were record levels. The public approved of what was going on. The problem is, now looking back at it, when people look at COVID, this whole Partygate thing, which was the beginning of the end of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, is much more high profile. But actually, the way the government handled the COVID crisis, certainly at the beginning, the way we got that vaccination rollout, which was world beating and undoubtedly saved thousands of lives. I think in the circumstances, the government did a pretty good job. the furlough scheme, the alternative to which was going to be losing thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs and thousands of businesses going under. I think Rishi Sunak, when he was Chancellor, made the right call. But of course, that cost a lot of money. That drove up debt. And so, in retrospect, the opposition parties who fully went along with what the government was doing say, oh, the government broke the country or whatever. Well, no government had to face a COVID crisis like this one did as well. So there's quite a lot of hypocrisy over what happened. Now, I think the government went too far in certain cases, and I actually voted against the government on some of the more extensive lockdown measures, because I think the government got the balance right. But give them a break, for goodness sake. No other government had to face those sorts of challenges, and everybody was feeling their way. And in the circumstances, I think overall, if you look at this subjectively, I think the government actually did a pretty good job, and I'd like to see anybody who would have done it better.
You mentioned there, actually, and I really wanted to touch upon that. It's a very interesting point of when you vote against the party that you're standing with. And I suppose it doesn't make people happy around you, but you're doing it for the benefit of you and the constituency. What is the internal debate like when you are voting against your party? Because ultimately, it's probably not going to be a positive one for you.
It's an interesting issue, and I got a bit of a reputation for voting against the government quite a lot, which was rather unfair. I mean, I was elected 7 times as a Conservative member of Parliament. Now, certain MPs might indulge themselves that they were elected because they're a brilliant MP and because of who they are. But you might get a personal vote of a few thousand extra votes, but it's largely down to the party label that you are standing on. And as such, you therefore have an obligation to go along with the manifesto on which you stood at the election. There may be 1 or 2 things that you diametrically disagree with, particularly if they have a big implication for your constituency. But by and large, you need to support the government on those issues which you stood on the manifesto for that party at the election. So in all my time, I think there was only 1 thing where I voted against the government on a manifesto issue, and that was on HS2. And I think I've been proved right on that, because I think it's a complete disaster. But I certainly didn't support HS2. There are other things I voted against the government on, say COVID and other issues, which were not manifesto commitments. There were things that came up. And in many cases, I'd vote against the government, and then a few weeks later, the government would actually do a U-turn and go along with what I voted for as well. So it's right that you need to act in the interests of your country and your constituents before your party, but at the same time, you've got to balance that with. But you did get elected as a Conservative MP on a Conservative manifesto, and I think constituents will respect you more if you don't blindly go into the government division lobby. But where there are things where it's very close and the government could lose, then you'll get some quite stiff words from the chief whip of your whip saying you really don't want to be doing this, do you? And obviously, if you're a new MP and you've got great ambitions about becoming minister and things like that, then you're more likely to do what you're told. When I'd been a minister, after that, I could do what I liked a bit more. So there was a certain freedom and satisfaction of freedom around that. But again, you have to balance that with I was elected as a Conservative MP. These were the policies that I was elected on, and I need, by and large, to follow them. But was at the same time, making sure how can we improve legislation, how we can put down amendments that actually make that legislation better.
Taking all of your experience into account and try to feel that ambition when you were younger to be Prime Minister, once you were in Parliament, did the ambition fade away?
Never fades away. But I mean, Parliament's full of 650 prima donnas who all think that they could do a better job than the current Prime Minister. But when you get there and when you see it at close hand, then you realise perhaps actually he or she is doing quite a good job. And, perhaps there are many others around me who could do a better job as well. It's a very competitive world. I became very involved in children's issues and being Shadow Children's Minister and then Children's Minister. I would have been very happy if I'd been able to stay on in that job. I would love to have a cabinet minister for children. It's something I've called for a long time, because I think it's a really important issue. But I became focused on that. So what I did in Parliament was largely around how we could improve the lot of children, be it in children's social care, be it in social outcomes, be it in school outcomes, education outcomes, or whatever. So most of my time in Parliament was focused on children's issues when I wasn't fending off the Chinese embassy or doing various other things that were all part of the job, and that was hugely satisfying.
Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. How would you rate those two as prime ministers in this country? Because obviously they both didn't have very long stints, and the Conservative Party did make quite a mare of deciding to get rid of their leader every few months. But in terms of Liz Truss, to start with, how would you rate her time as prime minister?
A disaster. And I said it at the time, and she became a minister when I ceased to become a minister. She came into the Department for Education as I left. She didn't do the job that I left, but that was her first ministerial job. And I always took the view that she was somewhat over-promoted. I think she was one of the blind spots of David Cameron, where he had this A-list of people that he thought would be good to promote, and she was very much in that in that guise. She didn't come from a traditional Conservative background. In fact, she was a Liberal Democrat when she was a student and first active in Parliament. She came from a state school background like I did. I think she was over promoted, frankly. I mean, she did a not bad job as Foreign Secretary in some respects, but she was over promoted. She just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and she was hugely unqualified to become Prime Minister. And I think her time as Prime Minister was the major contribution to our drubbing at the 2024 election. So whatever Rishi Sunak did after taking over from the Truss anarchy, as I called it, I'm afraid he was always on a hiding to nothing. And I think Rishi was a class apart from Liz Truss, but his timing was terrible because the damage had been done. But Liz Truss is a disaster. I think when she lost her seat and what she's done outside of Parliament since, she's just completely gone off on a tangent. She's become a Trump groupie and all sorts of other things, which is not where she started her political journey. It's been the most extraordinary political journey she's gone through. I think is just entirely incredible, and I think given the damage that she caused the party, an extended period of silence would be beneficial to everybody concerned. But she's not like that, alas.
And also, what about Rishi Sunak? And
I'm presuming you've met him. What's Rishi Sunak like as a person? I was pleased to support him as in one of the many leadership contests which we had, as you say, when he then came Prime Minister. He was a hugely smart guy, and he first got elected in 2015, and I saw him, and he was on the Brexit team. He was pro-Brexit as I was, and he was part of the group in Parliament who was leading on that, which is how I first got to know him. And he was a very smart guy. Huge attention to detail. I mean, he's really skillful as Chancellor. And on things like HS2, actually, I remember various conversations with him. He absolutely got it. He knew all the numbers and was asking all the right questions. So I think he was a really safe pair of hands. He was a really good Chancellor in really challenging circumstances when COVID was happening as well. I think it was a big leap to become Prime Minister for him. And he wasn't as political as I think you need to be when you're leading a party, and particularly when you're Prime Minister, as some of his predecessors had been. But for the final 2 years of the Conservative government, when he was the Prime Minister, as I said, the damage had been done. And it was a really, really difficult time for anybody who was being Prime Minister then. So I think he would have done a lot better in normal times, but he became the Prime Minister in certainly abnormal times, and so I don't blame him to any great degree for the disaster we had in the election in July 2024. I do blame him for calling the election in July 2024. I think it was very bad timing when actually it would have been better. He still wouldn't have won it, but I think the damage would have been less if he'd left it to the autumn, as most of us were expecting as well, rather than call a snap election when our party certainly wasn't ready for it.
We haven't got long left, but I really want to speak about the war in Ukraine. You've been pretty vocal on it before, and I suppose towards this, you, if I'm right in saying you were against a no-fly zone over Ukraine early on to stop the escalation. I've spoken to some experts on foreign policy, and they actually said, and the question's been brought up, whether NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine prior to Russia invading would have stopped a war happening. So I suppose that you would have probably disagreed with something like that as well, but what was your stance on that? Do you think that the NATO boots on the ground would have stopped the Russian invasion?
That takes us into a whole new ball game, frankly. Ukraine is not a NATO country. I would like to see Ukraine as a NATO country, but that is at the moment impossible, and that's seen as a step too far for Russia. And I have a degree of I would say sympathy, but understanding of why Russia takes that view. But frankly, if America had done what America should have done in terms of providing defensive support to Ukraine, which doesn't mean boots on the ground, but it means, and other European countries as well, had provided them with the hardware and the kit that they needed to repel the Russians. I mean, what the Ukrainians have done is incredible. I mean, the huge army that is Russia, not a very good army. They thought they would take over Ukraine with a matter of days, which is rather similar to what Trump thought he would do with Iran, and has proved wrong on. And for the Ukrainians to repel that military might of Russia initially, and then 5 years on, still keeping them at bay, pinned down in that corner, despite all the huge damage that's been done to their infrastructure, is phenomenal. And Ukraine, when all this conflict is over, Ukraine will have one of the most experienced, most powerful, most sought-after armies in the world, and I'd much rather have them on our side than on the other side. So we need to be doing as much as we can to support Ukraine, but that's very hard without America. And Trump has, without a shadow of a doubt, has extended the war in Ukraine by pandering to Putin. It's just difficult to understand that. Whereas actually, if they've supplied the hardware, if other European nations had supplied the hardware earlier, I think we've done the best job of the lot. And to give Boris Johnson his due, he was absolutely right at the vanguard of showing support for Zelensky and booting some backsides to our European neighbours, saying, look, this is all in our interest, because if Russia went in Ukraine, then Estonia's next, Finland, wherever else it may be. So we have a shared interest here. So I think Western nations could and should have done more earlier to give them the arms. But if we'd gone in ourselves, I think that takes it on a whole new level, and that could have got very, very messy. But there's what's going to happen? There's no sign of it ending, and of course now with Iran going on as well, that could embolden Russia to spin it out for even longer. But now Zelensky is playing a blinder by the experience they've got in anti-drone technology is now being sought after throughout the Middle East and even by America. So far from Trump accusing Zelensky of not having any cards, actually Zelensky's got some really powerful cards now, and I think the last laugh will be on the president, not on Zelensky.
Can we talk about the Conservative Party just briefly? Obviously, Kemi Badenoch's the leader. She won in 2024 against Robert Jenrick, who's obviously now, defected to Reform. Yes. As an MP, who did you
I
back? Did you back
absolutely did
Robert
not
Jenrick
back
or did you back
Robert
Kenny Badenoch?
Jenrick, and I dealt with him a lot when he was immigration minister, because I was deputy chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee and doing a lot on immigration legislation. I had lots of meetings with him, and he was woefully out of his depth. He was also a very weak Secretary of State for local government, and I've said that before he defected. So in the last leadership contest, and actually in the previous leadership contest, I signed Kemi Badenoch's nomination papers. I was one of the few old codger MPs to do that, because I saw Kemi when she came in 2017, and again, quite like Rishi Sunak, I saw that she was a really smart cookie. What I really liked about her is there's sort of no airs and graces. She tells it like it is. You know, she's quite combative. She's got a really interesting backstory as well. So I supported her right from the start in the last leadership election, and helped her campaign. And I speak to her a lot, and I think she is really impressive. But you know, she's got a hell of a job. It's a poison chalice being leader of the Conservative Party now, after what happened with the election. That she's got a hell of a job just to make the Conservative Party credible again for people to start to listen to. And I think what is interesting is you're seeing in the opinion polls, her personal ratings are much higher than the Conservative Party ratings. Actually, the same happened with Mrs. Thatcher back in the 1970s and 80s, where her ratings were higher than the party. But the next stage is to make sure that the party's ratings, you know, start to move up along with Kemi's as well. She is a really smart cookie, and I tipped her for leadership some time ago, and she's absolutely up to the job. And I think now, because that's getting recognised more, whereas a year ago she was being written off as, you know, there'll be another leadership contest along in a minute. Her poll ratings are starting to see that. She's getting, you know, good performances of Prime Minister's Question Time. She's getting out there, and I think that is boosting her confidence, and I think that's helping hugely. So she's going to be there for the foreseeable, and you know, if she can turn around the party's fortunes, then she stands a really good chance of being in the mix at the next election, and I'm sure would make a really impressive Prime Minister. And I say that not as somebody who's as a you know, loyal Conservative Party member, but she is exceptional, and certainly some of the people she's up against, starting with Jenrick, weren't.
Lastly, could you speak to me about the Green Party and reform, and just sort of put them into one category? They've had a rise, obviously, in terms of demographic, and young people are really starting to support them. This is obviously going to play a big part in the May elections as councils, but obviously, when the next general election comes around, how well do you think the Conservative Party is doing compared to the Greens in reform?
$64 billion question. Politics is hugely confused and hugely volatile at the moment, and anything could happen. When I stood in my seat in 2019, I think it was, or was it 2017? The combined Conservative and Labour vote was over 80%. And if you look across the country, you know, the two top parties absolutely dominated. Now, if you look at the opinion polls at the moment, the combined Conservative and Labour vote is under 40% in many cases. So the two-party system, which we took for granted for all of the last century, as it stands at the moment, appears to have disintegrated. Now, we may revert to type at the next election, but you have got some serious contenders in new-ish sort of disruptor parties in terms of reform and the Greens. And at the moment, because people are just pretty fed up with politics and politicians, they blame politicians for, you know, all the things that are going wrong, many of which are outside of our hands anyway. And so you're voting for somebody who's not the establishment, who's good at identifying the problems, which I think Nigel Farage is really good at, coming up with slogans saying we've got to stop the boats, you know, we've got to cut down on welfare scroungers, whatever it may be, in the inflammatory language which he will he will use. A lot of people saying, "Oh yeah, Nigel's right." Fine. So what are you going to do about it? So he's light on then coming up with detailed practical policies for how, if he were to get into government, you actually then do something about it. And there's a huge difference between identifying the problem and coming up with credible, practical, workable policies that can effectively address that problem. But at the moment, people just want to hear from somebody who's good at identifying the problems and is speaking their language. The Greens are doing a similar job on the left. I mean, I think the Greens under Zek Pelensky, who is an impressive character on the face of it, but has got some deeply, deeply troubling policies. When you actually look at some of the details of the stuff they're coming out with, starting with getting out of NATO, a lot of similarities with what Trump's saying now. Their views on housing and reform, their views on what's going on in the Middle East, deeply, deeply radical, and I think really dangerous. Now, when it comes to an election, then people aren't voting for who's saying the right thing about what the problems are and grumbling and raging against the establishment. People have then got to take into account, well, who would do a better job, and let's look at their policies. And at that point, the Greens' policies and Green Manifesto is going to come under far greater scrutiny. And I think most people are going to say, hold on a minute, that's not going to work for us. We can't vote for them. But at the moment, they are the disruptor party along with Reform on the left and on the right. So we have a highly unpredictable time in politics. So anything could happen, which is why I think there's every chance that Kemi Badenoch could come through the middle as somebody who's smart, who's got sensible, balanced policies that talk to the many problems that we've got, and have got practical, well-researched, well-thought-through. A lot of work still to do. Solutions for it could absolutely be in the mix as well. But anything can happen. I mean, you've got to be pretty brave or nuts to put money on who's going to win the next election at this stage, because anything can happen, which makes it exciting.
Well, Tim. Well, it does. And Tim, I really, really appreciate you joining me today. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. And thank you very much for your time.
Really interesting and very wide-ranging series of questions there. So thanks very much for the opportunity, Jamie.
Thank you so much, Tim. I really, really appreciate it.